This episode of Horsepower Heritage is sponsored by Model Citizen Diecast. Now, maybe you can't afford that full-size E30 M3 or that rare 71 Nissan Skyline GTR, and that's probably okay because your garage is already chock full of other projects, and you've been turning so many wrenches, your knuckles look like they belong to a prize fighter. The last thing you need to do is muck about with another old car. And that's where Model Citizen Diecast comes in. They sell collector-grade scale model cars from manufacturers like Amalgam, Auto Art, Mini Champs, and others. They stock 1/43rd scale and 1/18th scale offerings. From street cars to race machines, from pre-war classics to brand spanking new cars, Model Citizen Diecast has something for just about every interest and price range. Shop their online catalog at modelcitizendiecast.com or check out their Instagram page at Model Citizen Diecast. Model Citizen Diecast, because your inner child still wants to play with cars. Welcome to Horsepower Heritage. My name is Maurice and greetings to all of you far and wide, listening from places like Baldwin, Pennsylvania, Hialeah, Florida, Chicago, Illinois, Tucson, Arizona, Guangdong, China, Brisbane, Australia, Bucharest, Romania, and London, England. And that's just a few of the places that you're listening from. Well, I got to tell you, I'm having a busy autumn and I just can't get to it all. I have a motorcycle that I need to get ready for auction. I have a Land Rover restoration project that's been sitting for far too long, and I'm talking years. And right now I'm hunting for a Porsche 911 SC. I always wanted one, and I think it's about time. But all that stuff is sort of on the back burner right now because this podcast has become a big part of my life. And I'm not complaining. I love what I'm doing. And there are some episodes in the can that I think you're going to enjoy, and I'm in the process of booking more interviews for the future. And I'm always working on new storytelling episodes. But what all this means is that I'm actually running a little bit behind on my production schedule. Now, my goal is to release a new episode each week, but I really need to play catch up, so I'm taking a little break next week, and Horsepower Heritage will return on Wednesday, November 18th. Be sure to sign up for notifications on your phone so you don't miss out. And going down the road, you can pretty much plan on hearing a new episode each week. And if not, I will always let you know about changes in the schedule. Just a quick reminder, please give the show a 5-star rating and take a minute to leave me a review. Every rating and review helps boost the reach of the show. And don't forget to tell your friends about it, and I really appreciate your support. All right. Well, it was only a matter of time that we talked about flying and airplanes here. I've always loved aviation myself, so if you're a Warbird fan, you're going to love today's show. My guest is Mark Foster. Mark is a lifelong gearhead from dirt bikes to Ferraris, and he's been a general aviation pilot for many years. Mark is the president of the Lyon Air Museum in Orange County, California. He's an incredibly humble guy, and he's very enthusiastic about aviation and auto racing, and just mechanical stuff in general. And we had a great time. We talked about flying, aircraft restoration, historic warbirds, Mark's own car collection, and of course, the museum. And by the way, if you're located in Southern California and you're looking to set up a cool day trip with a group of your car or motorcycle friends, you should definitely call the Lyon Air Museum and arrange a visit. The people there are terrific, and they love to have groups come by to see the collection. It's a fantastic tribute to the American air crews of World War II, and it's a reminder of just how much they sacrificed for future generations. You can check them out at lyonairmuseum.org. By the way, that's Lyon, or on Instagram at Lyon Air Museum. Also, this episode is on my YouTube channel. Just search for Horsepower Heritage and subscribe, and you can check out all the cool airplanes that we talk about here. So, without further ado, I give you my interview with Mark Foster right here on Horsepower Heritage. Let's hit it. Welcome to Horsepower Heritage. My name is Maurice. Thanks for joining us. Today we're at the Lyon Air Museum in Orange County, California. And since we're on an airport, you will hear some jet noise from time to time on the audio. We're going to try to work around that. But this is a fantastic facility. It houses an incredible collection of World War II aircraft, automobiles, motorcycles, military vehicles. And my guest today is the president of the Lyon Air Museum, Mark Foster. Mark, thanks for joining us. So I said how impressive this place was, and I mean, there's just something to look at everywhere.
Yeah, well, our focus here is on the World War II aviation history, but then we tie in with a lot of the automobiles, military vehicles, and motorcycles, as you mentioned, and we really start with the story of World War II. Kind of starts at the close of World War I. So we start there, and then we go up through what we call the greatest generation, and those were the people who kind of came of age during the World War II period, the late 30s and early 40s. And we go right up through their service, which was the Korean War and the Vietnam War. And so that's kind of what we cover here throughout the museum.
Right. And you've been here, 12 years?
Yeah, we opened the museum officially at the end of '09.
But your involvement in aviation, you've had a long career, a lifetime in aviation.
Yeah, I started in high school, I think, is when I found aviation. And I found aviation through my car and motorcycle buddies. And they pointed me towards aviation, so that's how I ended up stumbling into aviation and got hooked like so many people do. And that was in the mid '80s. And so now we're 35 years later and still playing with airplanes.
I think we've got a 737 outbound. Yeah, I was actually going to ask which came first, cars and motorcycles or airplanes. Yeah. And I find it's usually cars and motorcycles.
Yeah, I think that's the easiest thing to access when you're a kid. And
sure.
So I started in three-wheelers, and then when I was 15 and a half, I was able to get your driver's learner permit or whatever, and most of my friends were riding skateboards and bicycles, and I was able to get a dual-purpose enduro type motorcycle that I could ride on the street and in the dirt. And so I felt like I was on cloud nine. I had this total freedom that so many other of my friends at the time didn't, maybe just because I was a couple months older than they were, and so it really started with all of that.
Did you live in a place where you had access to trails pretty quickly?
Yeah, I grew up in Glendora, California, just east of Los Angeles, and we had Glendora Mountain Road, which is a great road to drive, to ride on, and then there was a lot of little dirt trails and stuff around as well. And then we were always going out in the desert, and then we were going to the dirt race tracks around, like Riverside International Raceway at the time had dirt track as well, and so we did a lot of off-road racing at places like Riverside and Carlsbad and all those kind of places. So really got into it pretty heavily there when I was before I was really even an adult.
And then not long after that, you kind of got exposed to aviation.
Yeah, and I mentioned I had some friends who were car and motorcycle guys, and so one of them worked out at a place out in Chino, Aviation Museum, and he kept telling me, you got to come and check out this place. And he told me for like a couple of years, and I just finally one day, I worked at a race car shop. I was doing fabrication stuff at a race car shop. I was in high school, junior in high school, and there was no work that day. And so I hopped on my motorcycle and I rode out to this place and just instantly fell in love with these airplanes. I don't know if you watched movies like Baa Black Sheep, the Black Sheep Squadron,
sure.
Pappy Boyington, all
sure.
that back in the 70s. Well, the one of the Corsairs that they used in the filming of that TV series was there at this museum, the actual airplane that they used. And I walked up to it and I didn't know it was so big, and on TV they look smaller, and I just couldn't believe how awesome these things were. And the thing that really got me, because I was a car guy at that point, is that these old airplanes, they had internal superchargers. Some of them were turbocharged. They had all this technology that I thought was things that we were putting on cars in the 70s and 80s or something, and had no idea that in the 30s and 40s these airplanes were just doing it already. And so that really was interesting to me. So I went home, and at the time there's no internet or anything. We had an encyclopedia at home, like one of those big ones that was A through Z, and it would all fit like in this much. And I went through and I was trying to find anything I could on airplanes, and I went to the bookstore and I bought books on stuff and tried to learn as much as I could, and soon started volunteering to help with the airplanes, like restoring the airplanes. Started with that, and next thing I know, it became a vocation for quite a few years.
So getting in there and doing the restoration work had to expose you also to some guys who had flown those planes in combat?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Growing up in that time, the the World War II veterans were still fairly young. They were still out there. Some of them were still working. And so I got to meet a lot of guys who were, fighter aces of World War II. And there's still a few around, but not as many. But so that had an influence on me. So I felt like I was kind of in the right place for all of that.
Sure.
And so I got to spend a lot of time with them and learn from them. I think that was a really important time period in my life to be able to learn from those guys.
Well, that's what's cool about a place like this. You're preserving that history. By the way, are all the planes airworthy?
Yeah, all the airplanes in Lyon Air Museum are airworthy. However, we don't fly all of them. We don't keep all of them on an active flight status. So right now we have 4 airplanes that are airworthy and flown regularly. The B-25 right behind us here is the newest to add. It hadn't flown for a few years, and we're just getting ready to fly it again, and it'll be the 4th one. Right. And then we fly, do some local air shows, but mostly, just to do demonstrations here and
right,
give rides and so forth. Yeah.
I'll just go through a few of the aircraft. So behind me is a DC-3 in American Airlines livery. Mm-hmm. And is that an original American Airlines?
It is not. That airplane was born as a C-47A, which is the cargo version of the airliner. The airliner came first, and then the cargo version. So that one was built in 1942. That one saw service as a cargo and paratrooper airplane, even on D-Day. Mm-hmm. So it was a D-Day airplane, D-Day survivor. And then it was converted more toward an airliner configuration later on. And then we chose, when we acquired the airplane in, I want to say it was 2008, late 2008, we chose to put an American Airlines livery because of General Lyon, our founder's association with American Airlines.
Right. And we're going to talk more about General Lyon later on in the show.
It's a great subject.
Absolutely. And then next to the DC-3 is a C-47 with invasion stripes, wearing invasion stripes. And is there
there's a little story there, and it is closely tied to the DC-3 that we just spoke about. The C-47 was built in 1944, and when we got the airplane, it was in Israeli markings. From the Israelis operated it in their defense force, and we had been really the first active civilian owner of the aircraft. So we got it, and we were like, okay, we want to paint it up in some sort of World War II markings, and we started to research and everything, and we were unable to find any pictures of that airplane in combat, but we know that it went over to Europe in World War II in '44 sometime, and then we know that it stayed there after the war, and it stayed with the French for a period of time, and then the French transitioned it to the Israelis, and then it went into the civilian market to us. So we really didn't have a lot of history on it, but while we were doing that research, we found a lot of other sources of other serial number airplanes. So I thought, well, let's just look at the C-47A, the one that's now in American Airlines markings, and we found that airplane listed, and that's when we learned that it participated in D-Day. It was based at Exeter Field in England and flew with the 440th Troop Carrier Squadron. And so it was really exciting thing, but we had already put the airliner and airliner markings, so we thought, well, let's put the C-47 in the markings of the other airplane. Why not? So those two airplanes kind of have a tie, because when you look at the C-47, it's exactly what the C-47A, the DC-3, would have looked like back when it flew in combat during World War II.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And then the next plane over, just over Mark's right shoulder, is a B-25 Mitchell, medium bomber. And what's the story behind this plane?
Well, this airplane, it was built toward the end of the war, and it did fly a bit, but mostly like in the Aleutian Islands, more kind of air patrol kind of stuff, not any combat. It wasn't dropping bombs or anything like that. That's why some of the airplanes still exist, because they had a fairly safe, life back then. But great airplane. Probably one of the most historic of the medium bombers. And you think of like the Doolittle raid that took place in 1942, and where they took 16 of these airplanes and they launched them off an aircraft carrier, and they're never built to fly off of an aircraft carrier, but they lightened them up and craned them aboard the aircraft carrier and set sail for Japan. And the idea was to use these airplanes to send a message to the Japanese that that we could reach them. It wasn't that they could just reach our facilities like at Pearl Harbor, but we could reach them in their homeland. And it was more of a morale thing than anything, but ultimately became quite a successful mission, even though at the time it was thought a failure because a lot of the airplanes were lost and some of the crew members were lost and so forth. But
well, and two, they knew that was going to be a one-way trip.
Yeah, and it got even more so when they were spotted early. You know, the USS Hornet was spotted by a Japanese ship when they were still too far away from when they could launch. And they thought, well, we've been spotted. We either scrub the mission or we launch anyway. And they launched anyway, knowing that they weren't going to have enough fuel on the other side after dropping their bombs in Tokyo and going on into China. They wouldn't really make it where they needed to go. So a lot of them were bailing out along the shore there. And so Jimmy Doolittle at the time thought, wow, you know, I just led a terrible mission. And then they started looking at it and they go, wow, not only did it increase our morale, but then think of what it did to the Japanese at that time. And we needed to do that. We needed to show them that we could
strike back.
We could strike back, and so it kind of evened the playing field a little bit.
I actually flew to Japan and interviewed 3 Japanese veterans who were on the Pearl Harbor mission.
Wow.
They were all in their late 90s.
Yeah.
And it's not easy to get these guys. I had to email back and forth to a Japanese contact for like 2 months.
Wow.
And here's the interesting thing. He kept saying things like, this is very difficult to do. And I would respond back, thank you, I appreciate that, and I know you're doing your best to help us out, and please let me know if you have any news. And this went on for a while. And finally, one day, he said, it is arranged. And he gave me the names of the 3 guys we're going to interview. And the whole time I'm thinking, okay, well, this was great communication.
Uh-huh.
But it wasn't. One of my colleagues told me, he said, no, when he was telling you in those emails, this is very difficult, that's their way of saying no.
Yeah.
But I didn't understand that, so I didn't take no for an answer. And it's just funny how communication works, and our social etiquette in different cultures varies.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because we did a trip in 1995. We took 2 airplanes, a P-51 Mustang and a Japanese Zero fighter, to Japan to do air shows with them, and it hadn't been done, really ever with the Mustang and the Zero flying together, and it was fly as friends right. Air show. Right. And so we went over there, and we had to disassemble the airplanes, put them in a container, and then ship them over there, and then meet them over there and assemble them and run them and all that. And I went over as a mechanic. And then there was 2 guys who were flying them. I hadn't flown the P-51 yet, and so, but I'd run the stuff and been around it and so forth, and knew the airplanes pretty well. And so we were over there for months in '95. I think I was there for 70-something days in that period, over 5 trips. So we were doing a lot of back and forth. But what you just said there, I mean, it's a different culture. The communication, they were wonderful, but never really knew exactly if the message you were trying to convey was making it. We had some good interpreters, of course. But one thing that was probably my favorite thing we did there is after one of the air shows, one I remember in particular, we had the Japanese Zero pulled into just the front of a hangar, and the doors were open, and we had a line. They brought us all of these World War II veteran pilots, Japanese pilots, and they all stood in a line, and I stood up on the wing, and we helped them get into the cockpit, each one of them. And it was kind of a range of emotion, watching. Some of them got in and they just kind of looked around, and they got out, and I wasn't even sure if maybe they just got in the wrong line, maybe they had never even sat in a Japanese Zero before. And then others got in and they started reading all the, is it kanji, but whatever the writing is on the instrument panels, because that's all authentic in that airplane. And they started reading all that, and tears were coming down their cheeks, and it was just, you could tell they remembered that. And I even met one guy who had made multiple missions as a kamikaze, which is kind of odd to say, multiple missions as a kamikaze. Well, he kept setting out to attack a ship, and every time he took off, I'm sure people might, there's probably some humor in this, but he would take off. The airplane started running so poorly, he was truly afraid that he would not make it to the target and his life would be wasted by just crashing en route. So he would come back to the base and say, it's not running right. And they thought, oh, well, you're just afraid to go on the mission. He's like, no, I really want to go on the mission, but you got to fix the airplane. And somehow in all this, it was right toward the end, and he never went on the final mission with an operating airplane, and he survived and to tell that story. And these were the stories we were hearing, and it was just absolutely incredible.
I get a little bit of emotion about these airplanes. Mm-hmm. They're really special.
They really are, yep. And there's such a connection to the character of the people who built them, flew them, maintained them, supported them. I mean, you can just feel all of that when you're around these airplanes.
What'd you think of Japan, by the way? Pretty interesting country.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. The food was fantastic.
Oh yeah.
The hospitality, excellent. It was kind of funny because I'm a very independent person. I like to be on my own schedule all the time, which is just one of my interesting characteristics, I guess. But over there, we were on somebody else's schedule. They would pick us up, they would take us to dinner, they would drop us back at the hotel, they would do all this stuff, they would travel. And they wouldn't really tell us any of this. So we would get in a car and we thought, maybe it's, we're going to drive 20 minutes to a restaurant. It would be 2 hours.
Wow.
And then other times you get in a car and you'd hang a U-turn and stop on the other side of the street and get out and go into a restaurant. So you never knew, but wherever they took us, it was always fantastic.
Well, they wanted to impress you.
Yeah, they did. When you say impress us, on my last trip, I went one more time in '96 on a unrelated to the air shows thing, but we actually took a T6 Texan over there and assembled it and checked out someone there, an air show pilot, Japanese air show pilot, and he was going to do air shows with the airplane. So we went over there in '96, and we were going to be there about a week, and there was two of us. A friend of mine who was a former F-16 fighter pilot, and so we got there, and they asked us, do we have a international driver's license? And we kind of look at each other and we go, no. And they go, oh, that's okay. And we're thinking, well, of course it's okay. You guys drive us everywhere. What are you talking about? We get to the hotel, and the guy turns around. He goes, we have Ferrari for you. And we go, okay. And so we were there for a week, and they gave us a 348 TS, and they gave that to us for a week to drive. So the two of us, my F-16 fighter pilot buddy friend, and I and the airport and the hotel were 45 minutes apart. So every day we had it was basically an hour and a half trip in this car. But just one of those, there's hospitality. They just insisted that we drive this car, and here we were, we're driving on the other side of the road, but still the steering wheel's on the side it's, that we're used to. And so we were always reminding each other when we pull off the road,
right.
Stay to the left, not to the right, stay to the left, that sort of thing. But yeah, great hospitality. They're just wonderful people.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And then over my right shoulder is an A-26 Invader.
A-26 Invader, and so this was built by Douglas, and this one is in the livery or the markings of a Korean Air War aircraft, kind of a night attack aircraft. But these airplanes have history back to World War II. A-26 is built by Douglas in World War II, Korea, and then even in Vietnam. So they were still flying them in Vietnam. Right. So it's one of the few airplanes. I know the C-47 did the same thing, but as a more aggressive airplane to fly and fight in all three wars. And some people get these mixed up with the B-26, the Marauder.
Which was a Martin.
Which was a Martin, very good, yeah.
And then the next plane over is probably, it's the most famous bomber of the war, if not the most famous plane, the B-17 Flying Fortress.
Yeah, so it was a heavy bomber, World War II. It was powered by 4 big radial engines, and it would carry typically 9 to 10 guys into combat. A lot of these probably made famous during the daylight bombing missions over Germany, and where some of the losses were really heavy at the time. And it wasn't really until the P-51 Mustangs came along on the calendar there, and were able to escort these airplanes all the way to Germany and back, and then they started becoming more and more successful. But yeah, most famous bomber probably of all time, the B-17 Flying Fortress.
Yeah, prior to the Mustang coming into the theater, the P-47 did not have the range to get that deep.
Yeah, they could escort them a ways toward the target, but they just couldn't stay with them the whole time, and they couldn't loiter with them. They couldn't do anything, you know. So it was a great airplane, but it just didn't have the range. And the P-51s, of course, you know, burning a lot less fuel and a little, you know, and nice and fast, and so they could get there and stay with them the whole time.
And you've flown the Mustang.
Yes, I'm one of the fortunate people who I still can't believe that I've gotten to fly P-51s for a good period of my life. Yeah.
We'll talk about that. 2 more planes to mention. T-6 Texan, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. World War II.
Yeah, advanced trainer.
Advanced trainer, yeah. And last but not least is the 01 Bird Dog, which is a Cessna, and that's your personal aircraft.
Yeah, that's my personal airplane, and that's an airplane that was designed in the late 40s, and they used them heavily in Korea as observation airplanes, and then again in Vietnam as forward air control airplanes. You know, they were typically unarmed. They had a pilot and an observer in them. They did have these 2.75-inch rockets on the wings that were target marking rockets. So, you know, they would fly low over the jungle canopies, let's say in Vietnam, and they would look for, you know, maybe ammunition stores or whatever by the enemy, and they would mark them with these rockets. They would fire these rockets into this area, and these rockets were white phosphorus. They would put up a colored smoke. And then they had all these radios. They could talk to people on the ground, people in the air, and you know, and everybody. And they would say to maybe the fast-moving fighters and bombers, "Okay, hit my smoke." If they actually hit the target, then they'd say, "Hit my smoke," or they would say, "Hit 1 click south of my smoke." And so they could use that smoke as a way of where to drop, point. Because the fast-moving fighters and bombers, they couldn't see that stuff because it was just all jungle, right? So these guys could see it because they were flying low and slow. So they were really heroes. There was 2 Medals of Honor winners flying 01 Bird Dogs, and so, you know, it was really quite an airplane, and that was something I found interesting. It was an all-metal airplane, and I was looking for something that I could fly, you know, and something fun. And I looked around quite a bit, and I thought, you know, the Bird Dog made the most sense. And at the time, I really didn't have a lot of savings for such a thing. I think I had $5 saved up for an airplane, and so I thought that was a good time to buy an airplane. So I looked basically like all over the world. I didn't travel the world, but just through, you know, mail and all that kind of stuff. And
this was pre-internet?
This was internet,
okay.
You know, but I'm just, emailing people and so forth. And I ultimately, after looking for, you know, pretty solidly for a couple of years, I came across one that was literally a couple hundred yards from my then office. It was in a hangar in storage, and it had been crashed. And so it was pretty damaged, you know, and I kept looking at it, and you know, I thought, no, I don't need that kind of big project. But while I was looking for a project, I was finding where, I like to say, all the bones were buried, you know, dog bones, I guess. And so I know where there's an engine, I know where there's a firewall, I know where there's a right flap, I know where, it just in my head, I had this inventory. And so when I saw this crashed airplane, I thought, you know, this could be a project. So I thought about it for a day or two, and I went and we worked out a deal, and I bought the thing on borrowed money, and I spent the next 6.5 years of my, you know, evenings and weekends and holidays and lunch money and so forth to restore the airplane.
We all have a pretty good idea of what it takes to restore an automobile or a motorcycle, but how do you compare an aircraft restoration?
Well, there's a lot of regulation in aviation, and it's you know, needfully so that exists. And so I came from, just backing up a little, I wasn't just this guy who thought, hey, I think an airplane would be neat, and I'm a car guy, I'll just go buy an airplane. I actually did aircraft restoration at that point for about maybe 10 or 12 years. So, and it was a lot of the type of damage that was done to the airplane was the type of damage I was restoring, you know, fixing on other airplanes. So I had a pretty good idea of what I was getting myself into. But with airplanes, everything's documented. You know, there's record keeping, and there's steps along the way where an airframe and power plant mechanic may be doing the work, and then an inspector authority, who's an FAA designee, comes in and certifies the work, so to speak, like looks over and double checks everything. And then there's logbook entries, and there's forms that get submitted to the FAA so that there's information that kind of follows that airplane of what kind of repairs were done to it, that kind of thing. And I think there's similarities I think you clean things and you straighten things and you paint them and you use all new hardware and and all that kind of stuff. So I think there's a lot of similarities in the aircraft restoration, and I'd say the differences are more on like the regulatory side, record keeping and so forth. You don't have to sign off a car really for most part.
You're a guy who's living in these sort of two communities, the aviation community and the car community, and I don't know about you, but I think that those communities are really special. What do you think makes them special, if you agree with me?
Well, I think there's the passion for, there's the machinery. There's a passion for the machinery, but then it's the people and the shared passion. I really think it's the people. Car people are just great people. Airplane people are great people. So I think if I walked into this hangar every single day and there was no one here, it wouldn't have nearly the impact on me that it does knowing that they're tied to all the people. And every machine has the story of who owned it, drove it, flew it, whatever, and then their story. So that's always the thing I want to research. You can take a Carrera, Porsche Carrera, a beautiful 4-cam car, and then when you find out who its owner is or who its previous owner was, its caretakers, then there's more to the story. You can almost feel that in the car. So I think that's what it is. There's just so much to the automotive, world,
right.
The culture, and so much to the aviation community that it's like bigger than life. It's really hard to ever get bored with it.
For me, it's that kind of living history aspect. Old cars and motorcycles and airplanes, for that matter, it's about as close as I'm ever going to get to time travel. Mm-hmm. And I've kind of mentioned this in other podcast episodes. It just takes you back, and that's really cool.
Yeah, it's I've had some wonderful opportunities in certain airplanes where I'm flying the airplane, and I use airplane car would be the same thing, and I'll add to that. But where I'm looking through the windscreen down the nose of this airplane that flew in World War II, that's got combat history in World War II, I'm seeing the same thing that young guy who was probably in his early to mid 20s in World War II was out in the South Pacific somewhere, looking at that same view. I've chased a Japanese Zero around, an air show circuit in a Corsair, and the Japanese Zero is puffing smoke. It's got a smoke system, so I'm behind him and the smoke's coming by, and it's like I'm, and I don't want to glorify the combat side of it, but I'm just saying there's that connection to history.
Right.
And it's like you can't fake that. You can't do virtual reality. I mean, that's the real thing right there.
Let's talk about your personal experience flying. Did you take to flying naturally?
But I think the first 4 hours were frustrating.
Yes.
Which is really funny, the first 4 hours. I remember I was doing landings, and it was my 4th hour, and I was at this airport called Rialto Airport. It doesn't even exist anymore. And I looked over at my instructor, and I was just, I go, I'm just not getting it. I was just, touching down, bouncing, swerving, and all this. And it's my 4th hour landing, and, doing landings in an airplane. But I think we all experience that sort of thing. But then 4 hours later, I soloed. So it's it's one of those things where I think everybody's on a different route. Some people it takes 30 or 40 hours and they get it, and some people get it kind of quickly. And I think I would say among my peers I was probably in the average. I think 8 hours. I think I had 8.3 hours or 8.1 hours, something like that, when I soloed.
And there's probably no better place in the world to learn how to fly than Southern California, because the views are incredible. You've got the ocean to one side, the mountains rising up on the other side, and that high desert.
The desert. I loved the desert when I was early on in flying. I always loved going out in the desert. I read a lot about the test flying that took place up at Edwards Air Force Base and Rogers Dry Lake and and all that stuff, and so to go up there and see it, and you could actually fly fairly close to the south side of Edwards Air Force Base and not be in the restricted area.
Right.
So I would go and fly along there, and I would see SR-71s flying, and all sorts of neat airplanes flying air to air. I'd see them, they'd be a couple miles away, but I go, wow, there's a SR-71 flying, and so that was a really magical time too to be able to do that. But my first small airplane ride was in a P-51 Mustang. Had a little jump seat in it, and I got to do it. And that was in May of 1987, and of course was hooked after that, because the Mustang is the definitive fighter of World War II. It's the most famous of almost all airplanes in the history of airplanes, right? then I did everything else. I went and got my license. I solo got my license, did all the other stuff you do in small airplanes, built my flight time over the next 10 years. And so now I want to fast forward to 1997. So it's 10 years later. I've flown a T6 Texan, I've flown a Stearman, I've flown a lot of the other airplanes that would prepare you to fly a Mustang. I had ridden in some other Mustangs, but I had not ridden in that Mustang that I had my first small airplane ride since then. It came time to get checked out in a P-51 Mustang. We had access, there was a guy named Darrell Bond, he had they called it a TF, a trainer fighter, a dual-controlled P-51 Mustang. So we had access to that airplane. So there's a guy named Steve Hinton, who is a really well-known warbird pilot, probably the best of the best. And he said, okay, we'll check you out in the Mustang, and he said, I'll let you solo my Mustang, which is the first small airplane I ever went for a flight in, 7715 Charlie. It's now called Wee Willie 2. And so I thought, okay, that's a good deal. So we took Darrell's airplane, and I sat in the front, and Steve sat in the back, but it's dual controlled. We did 2 flights, and after the second flight, he goes, you're good. He goes, you can go fly my Mustang. And so his airplane was out on the tarmac, ready to go. This is like everything I've ever wanted in my whole life, was to solo a P-51 Mustang, and now I've given the opportunity. All I have to do is walk out, do a pre-flight on it, strap into it, and go.
Were you nervous?
Yeah, I guess you're nervous. I mean, because you want to perform well. You don't want to do anything that embarrasses you. You don't want to do anything that will hurt the airplane. You don't want to do anything that will kill you. So
Sure.
Those 3 things are really important. So I walked out and strapped into the airplane and took off and flew it around. And I remember kind of looking at my watch and thinking, well, I guess it's getting about time to go back and land this thing. By the way, you can't see out the front of it when you land. There's no forward visibility. And thinking, okay, but I had flown the other Mustang from the front seat, actually earlier that day. So come back in and do a normal landing and taxi in and shut down and drive home. And then I get home and probably somebody asked me to dump the trash or take out the trash or do the dishes or whatever.
Back
so
to reality.
You go from fighter pilot to normal guy again. But it's not too often that you can have 2 flights in the same airplane 10 years apart. I'd only flown in that airplane twice. One, my very first small airplane ride, the second time solo.
That's a pretty neat story.
So it's kind of a fun story.
So how about like the performance of the Mustang? I mean, what's it like to fly? I think most of us have an idea of maybe what a Cessna feels like or a Beechcraft, but the Mustang is a completely different ballgame.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing with the airplanes, of course, they do have performance, but I think the big thing about particularly the World War II airplanes that are like the fighters, most of them are we call them tail draggers. There's a tail wheel, there's no nose gear, like the B-25 has a nose gear. Most Cessnas have a nose gear, so it's tricycle gear. Car guys, everybody can appreciate this because you have a Porsche that's rear engine powered, right? And it's got all the weight back there, and they talk about it doing some weird things if you're not aware of what's going on, right?
Sure, never lift.
Yeah, never lift, right? So in the flying world, the tail wheel airplanes versus the tricycle gear, the center of gravity is behind the main landing gear on a tail wheel airplane, and the center of gravity always wants to get in front of you. I mean, it's the heaviest thing, right? So
Sure.
If you start to swerve, it wants to completely swerve. So a tail dragger is always, the tail wants to get in front of you.
Right.
So your job is to keep it behind you.
Right.
And you use the rudder for that and some differential braking if you're really in trouble. Now, you do have some weather vaning effect. You have things like if the wind's straight down the runway, it helps keep things going straight. I mean, there's a lot of that going for you. But so a Mustang is a tail dragger. So you have to have that training to get to that level. So that's that one thing. And then you add the 1,490 horsepower or 1,600 depending on where emergency. But you add that horsepower to it, and then the value and the history and everything else, and that's your experience. You can't see out the front of these tail draggers very, very well. A Mustang is fairly narrow at the nose, so your peripheral vision is, you see here and here, right? A Corsair, fatter, you're farther back, so now you see here and here, so you kind of lose a little. So that means like when you taxi, you have to do S-turns. You have to look this way and look that way. You kind of hang your head out when you're doing S-turns taxiing out. If you don't, you could run into a whole airplane in front of you.
And not see it.
A whole airplane happens. You can go on YouTube and watch people running into airplanes, and people have been unfortunately killed because the guy was taxiing out and didn't do an S-turn and ran into somebody in front of him. The people get in front of you, you just can't believe it. It's like like driving blind, right? And then some of the difference between the Mustang, of course, is the Mustang's designed, and I mentioned Porsche before. I think Porsche is great. We're surrounded by Porsches, right? When you sit in a Porsche, it just feels right. Like everything's kind of in the right spot.
It's like you're wearing the car.
You're wearing the car. It's in the right spot. And a Mustang is very much like that, where the throttle is, where the stick is, where your feet, you go forward, and where the rudder pedals are, and the way the instrument panel's set up, and you really feel like you wear it, and it just feels great. Then you get into an airplane like the Corsair. And the Corsair is a Navy airplane, carrier-based fighter, and you get in that airplane, and it's just like an awkward truck, but it's really cool. It's a cool, awkward truck. So now, what do we compare in the car world to that? I'm sure there's something. Maybe you're
probably a pre-war Bentley.
Yeah, something like that. So it's kind of cantankerous, and it's neat, but it's not ergonomic. And so the Corsair, instead of having your hand way out with the throttle on it, it's kind of back here, like this, and you sit really far behind the center of gravity, so far behind it that when you look down out of the cockpit, you see the ground. Whereas in a Mustang, you're kind of on the center of gravity. You look down, you're looking at the wing because you're above the wing. So you're way back, and then it's got this really long nose, and it's got a 2,000 horsepower radial engine up there. And I forgot how far it is away from you, but it's really far. I mean, it's like,
a hike.
Yeah, and you're thinking, like, you're looking up there, and it's got this propeller, and I think it's about 13 feet 1 inch. Some people out there might correct me and say somewhere over 4 inch, but it's over 13 feet in diameter. That's a big propeller, right? So this big Hamilton standard propeller out there. It's big aluminum blades on the early 3-bladed Corsair, like the one that I'm associated with. And you move the throttle, and the engine reacts to it, but you're like, wow, I mean, it's like in a different area code. I mean, it's really far away, It's really something. So, and it's awkward. Bounce back to the P-51. The P-51 has steerable tail wheel. And so when you're on the ground and you're taxiing, you move the rudder pedals, and it steers the tail wheel. It puts pressure on it. It'll steer the airplane to a certain range. The Corsair, the tail wheel is free castering, and it has a lock-unlock. And so you would unlock it for carrier landing because you're going to use the hook to land, and then you lock it if you're going to land on a runway, just a regular runway. And so when you're taxiing out, it's unlocked so you can do your S-turns. But there's really not a lot to keep it from swerving off the runway. I mean, you literally, when you're taxiing something like a Corsair, if you look into the cockpit and look down to change a radio frequency to anticipate, like, I'm going from ground frequency to tower frequency, and you switch that, you'll be off in the dirt. I mean, you really have to be paying attention because of the tendency. So, trying to compare that to, cars. You get different views out of a car, different performance. I'm sure the high performance cars versus something that you really have to work hard to drive. Like on a racetrack, some of the slower cars really require a lot to keep your momentum going and all that. Kind of the same between Cessna 150 and the P-51 Mustang.
What it makes me think of is, a lot of the pre-war cars where you had a magneto and you had to adjust your spark advance, and you had to pressurize your fuel system with the hand pump on those little tiny things that were engineered out of cars, but they demand your attention.
Yeah. And the airplane has those too, because you're changing altitudes. So, your pressure's changing. So, like, you have to rejet a carburetor if you're going to take your car to the mountains or whatever, unless it's some fancy newer fuel injected, whatever car. But the old cars, right, change the jetting. In an airplane, you can't be changing the jetting when you climb through 4,000 feet or 6,000 feet. So you have a mixture control. And and many of them, they do have some that are automatic mixture, but a lot of the time you're constantly leaning as you go up in altitude, and so you have, in a car, you have, let's say, a manual transmission, like a 4-speed or whatever, and a clutch, or you have an automatic, and the automatic, maybe it's first, second, third, and sometimes like an overdrive, right? In an airplane, that propeller out there is kind of if you wanted to think about it, it's kind of like your transmission, because as you have different air loads on that propeller, like if it's a fixed pitch, which means it's just a solid propeller like the Wright brothers, it's just a piece of wood, or a piece of metal that's ground to a blade. If you start diving, the RPM of your engine's going to go up. Even if you don't put any fuel to it, it's just going to start going up, because the propeller is driving the engine. So you start going down, and you start getting that. And then if you pull up, and unless you add more power, if you have any more power, you might be at full throttle, but it's going to start bogging down, right? So then they have, on airplanes like the P-51 and the Corsair and all that, T6, they have a constant speed propeller. So the blades actually change. They're a variable pitch, and they've got something called a propeller governor, and without getting too complicated, but it basically drives off of the engine speed, and it senses right when the engine speed starts to, you set an RPM, so you set it 2,000 RPM, and you start diving. Right when you start that dive, that before it even shows on your tachometer, right, RPM gauge, before it even shows on that, the engine starts to sense it. This little thing's spinning around, and these little weights start going out. Like if it starts increasing, the centrifugal force pulls them out. That pulls a little valve that allows oil to be ported to one side of the propeller system that changes the pitch, and it makes the pitch more coarse, so it starts to bog it down. Because if not, if you left it flatter pitch, you're going to get a lot of RPM, right? So now you're diving, and it's starting to pull back. If you start diving really steep, and it's gone back as far, it'll try to hold that 2,000, try to hold it. Now it's done. It's the blades are as coarse as they can go, and you're still diving, and you're still going steeper and steeper. Now your RPM will start coming up. And the same thing in a climb. It'll try to hold that RPM at 2,000, it'll hold, and you start getting up here. Eventually, the blades have gone as flat as they can for the most high RPM, and it's holding that 2,000, and pretty soon now it's 1,900, 1,800, 1,700, and it's falling off, because now you're going almost vertical, and you're either gonna have to put more power to it, or it's just going to sit there and it's going to govern. It's already done governing. It's just going to drop off. So interesting thing, because the transmission in your car kind of has that same kind of feel to it. So
sure,
there's a lot of differentials there.
And what's also cool about that is it's an entirely mechanical and hydraulic system.
Yeah. All that's the other thing when we talked about what drew me to the airplanes from the cars and motorcycles when I was a kid is all those systems. Everything's very mechanical. It's very advanced. I mean, you think of for that time, it's really interesting. But like that prop governor, right? Somebody had to figure that out,
right.
and the way the carburetors are, they're pressure carburetors, so they don't have a float in there, and then pressure carburetor typically, you can go upside down for a period of time, and the float, you don't have a gravity issue and all that kind of stuff, and it's and then there's boost pumps to keep pressure. So for like takeoff, in your old Bentley or whatever, you're pumping up the fuel pressure, right? Well, in one of the old airplanes, you're turning on a boost pump to make sure that you have fuel pressure, because they're not gravity feed, and that pressure carburetor is going to need it. It's got an engine-driven fuel pump that's on all the time. It's driven mechanically by the engine. Then you have an electric auxiliary or boost pump. So just get technical. I think people like that kind of stuff. But
they do.
But
by the way, the centrifugal governor mechanism. So that that goes back to steam engines.
Yeah.
Stationary engines.
Exactly. Yeah. So they pull that technology from that and started. When the first airplanes didn't have those propellers.
Right.
But then they started going, look what we're doing with the steam locomotive stuff and all that. And they let's take some of that technology and solve a problem.
I'll tell you what I've never been able to wrap my head around is how they synchronized the guns and the props in World War I so that you wouldn't shoot your own prop off.
Yeah. So they supposedly have, and I haven't played with one of those mechanisms because they're just not on any of our airplanes, but they have basically an interrupter,
right,
so that, the gun will not fire when the blade is right in front of the gun, because you're shooting through the propeller blades, right? So they have to shoot in between them, and if that gets out of sync, then you end up shooting a bunch of holes in your propeller blade, and you can see pictures that's happened. They also have those, if you're on like a B-17 or whatever, and you've got a gun and you're sweeping, you're shooting at, at the time an enemy airplane, so it's a Focke-Wulf 190 or a Messerschmitt, and you're following it, pop, 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 and then your tail's right there. Well, you can't rely on this 18-year-old kid to let up off the trigger and not shoot the tail and then start shooting it again as this thing goes behind the airplane. So they have interrupters, so it won't shoot when there's part of your airplane in it. At least theoretically it
right.
won't. Yeah, I think sometimes that didn't always work, but interesting though.
Imagine you're the 18-year-old ground crewman who has to synchronize the guns on a SPAD or a,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's a lot of responsibility in all that stuff. Yeah. And a lot can go bad in a hurry.
One of the cool things about a lot of these World War II aircraft is that they had forced induction because you're flying high, you need the performance, the air is thin. So, like for example, the Mustang, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very critical. So the Mustang has an internal supercharger, and that's required again when we talked about the altitude compensation. But really, an airplane's going to produce its power kind of at sea level. At the highest barometric pressure, right? As you go up, that goes down, and you start getting less and less, and eventually you run out. You just don't have enough air to get through the engine. It's too thinly spread out, right? So you have to forced induction, like you mentioned, and so some of the airplanes were turbocharged, some of them were supercharged, some of them were turbocharged and supercharged. So the P-51 has an internal supercharger. The T-6 has a supercharger. So it's an advanced trainer. World War II has a supercharger, kind of neat, right? The Corsair, a supercharger. It's basically an impeller at the back of the engine. It's just like that big, and it's a little impeller and just pushes a bunch of air in there. The B-17, the Flying Fortress, that was, each of the engines has an internal supercharger, but then they had a turbocharger. Each of the engines has a separate turbocharger with a wastegate at the back and all that. You can see them on our airplane over there. So that's technology that's from the 30s.
Right.
And we get all excited about these, new little cars that have the, hey, it's turbocharged. Well, that's great. They had that in the 30s.
Yeah. So much technology trickled back and forth between aviation and automobiles, particularly race technology. Mm-hmm. One thing I just want to mention really quickly, none of these aircraft were pressurized.
None of the airplanes that we have here are pressurized.
The B-29 was pressurized.
Yes.
But that was like the first, was it not? The first combat aircraft.
Yeah, in that direction. Yeah.
Right, yeah. So about the Lyon Air Museum. So General William Lyon established the museum. In researching General Lyon, what I thought was cool was, so when he was born, you still didn't need a license to be a pilot. The formal licensure process had not been established by law yet. And by the time he retired, we'd been to the moon and back. We had the space shuttle program. Mm-hmm. So that's quite a lifespan.
Yeah.
And by the way, I should mention that General Lyon passed away in May 2020.
Yeah. So probably one of the most interesting people you can ever imagine, General William Lyon. You started off when he was a kid. He was born in 1923, and so he was a young guy just as World War II was breaking out, and he wanted to be a Navy pilot. That's what was his thing. It was kind of funny. He wanted to be a naval aviator, and he actually went through the process, and it looked like he, Navy ROTC, and it looked like he was going to go that route, and he got to the physical. They do basically kind of a flight physical thing, and he failed the physical due to a deviated septum. Just a weird situation. So he had it corrected. He had it actually surgically corrected and went back, and would you believe that he got the same examiner, and the same examiner failed him again. I think probably because he knew like pre-existing condition kind of thing. So he failed him again. So General Lyon was really not a big fan of the Navy after that, but he ended up becoming a flight instructor, a civilian flight instructor, and he got assigned in Arizona to train ultimately, ironically, naval aviators. so he became a flight instructor, and he did that for a while, and then he was always trying to get something going to where he could go be in the military and fly overseas. World War II was going on, and so he threw a lot of effort on his part, but he ended up aligning himself with the Ferry Command, and these are the guys who were were delivering airplanes all over the world. And so and at the time he thought he was really missing out. He thought, gosh, I want to just be assigned, I want to go overseas and I want to just fly in a squadron with some group. And but what had ended up happening is he was flying all these different airplanes and he was getting all this great experience. And that great experience really served him well for many years to come. But so after the war, he was a service pilot. He didn't really even have the official Army wings, would later Air Force wings. He had these wings that they basically have an S in them as a service pilot, and it's kind of like he thought it was embarrassing. He walked in like, well, you're not one of the real guys, and that drove him crazy. But he had to continue to campaign, and finally he became a lieutenant. He got his commission, became a lieutenant in the Air Force, and then he was in the reserves, and ended up volunteering going to Korea in the reserves, and he flew at full time there. He did like 75 combat missions while he was there. He was flying C-46s and C-47s. We have the C-47 here, and then meanwhile working his way up. He had started his home building business in the 50s. He ultimately became Chief of Air Force Reserve, so it's the highest ranking general in the Air Force Reserve. He's the top guy, and so he was doing that from 74 to 79, and he was flying all these type of airplanes all throughout his career, which is just really amazing because a lot of people will only fly one or two airplanes in their military flying career, and that's it. He recognized that there wasn't anything local, locally here in Orange County, where the next generation could come and learn about the greatest generation. And he had been motivated. He was over at the American Air Power Museum in Great Britain, and he served on their board, and he was really motivated by the way they were telling the story. He thought, I really need to do something like that here. So he founded Lyon Air Museum here, and a big thing of what he wanted to do is make sure that the school kids got to meet some of the World War II veterans, and really, maybe some of that character could make it to the next generation. So through a lot of his efforts, we were able to get with the local Newport Mesa Unified School District. They added us as part of their 6th grade curriculum, and so we have field trips. We have 60-something classes come through the museum every year, and that's all because of General Lyon's vision of wanting to share the stories of the greatest generation.
Do you think kids today are still impressed with all this? I mean, they've got a million things that are bombarding them, electronics.
Exactly. It's such a great question, and I thought the same thing. I was really wondering, how is this really going to go? Are the kids going to come here and kind of be disrespectful, and just because they're, they got their own things in life, and this doesn't mean as much to them. And so what we had done is we made these, I call them hero cards, but we made these little baseball cards, and we made them for many of our World War II veterans. We thought if we just give them to them and they could hand them out when they're doing tours and everything. Well, we did our first tours with the school groups, and I thought I'd find these cards everywhere, all over the floor, and I wasn't sure what was going to happen. But what I found is at the very end, we do a 20-minute free period where the kids can just hang out together, they can walk around, and they can see everything. They were standing in line to get autographs on the cards. And when they were walking out, they were looking through their cards, and they were treating them like they were like collector cards.
Right.
I mean, they really got it. So that's that was like such an awakening to see that, like, this is really working. They're getting to learn from these people who are old.
Right.
In their eyes, right? These are just old guys. But these old guys used to be in their late teens and early 20s,
right,
and they were doing hero stuff every single day.
Yeah, when I think about a 22-year-old as pilot in command of a B-17, mm-hmm. I mean, when I was 22, I couldn't make it to an 8 a.m. class in college,
Yeah.
I mean, I could barely do my own laundry.
Exactly.
It's really impressive what those guys did, and there's a reason we call them the greatest generation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what's fascinating to me is that General Lyon was sharp enough to realize the demand for housing in Southern California after the war, and he got in on the ground floor.
Yeah, that was perfect for him to see that. And he had done that. He had purchased a house up in the Fullerton area, and he watched how the whole process, took place, and he saw all these kind of mistakes that were being made on, you know, customer service and you know, timing and quality and everything. And he goes, well, gosh, I could do better than that. So he and his brother and his dad said, hey, let's get something started here. So they started the home building business. And the wonderful thing about it was, like you said, it was in a period where it was just going gangbusters after that. But that made him highly successful so that he could give back to the community. And it was all because of that vision, wanting to do a better job in the home building.
Pretty cool stuff. You know what we haven't talked about yet, Mark, is your personal cars.
No.
You're kind of a Ford guy, right?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah.
So tell us about that.
I was always a car guy, but I was really focused on the airplanes and so forth. And so I guess I was coming out of the car closet, you know, and really, I was finding myself at Cars and Coffee early mornings all the time. And then I started going to Pebble Beach, and I really got it. And I was always going to races, and I always liked that stuff. But I started looking at it more like, what would I want? Like, what collector cars are interesting to me? And back when I was in high school, I remember a friend of mine's dad talking about Ken Miles and the 427 Cobra,
sure,
and doing the 0 to 100 and back to 0 in 13 point something seconds. And I thought, wow, for a car at the time was 20 something years old, it was still beating everything. And I just thought that was the coolest thing in the world. So fast forward to a few years back, and I started going, well, I don't have any room in my garage. I got this airplane I got to take care of. I just enjoy other people's cars and and all that. Next thing I know, I own a 427 Cobra. It's one of the CSX 4000 series continuation cars. It's an alloy bodied car, which is a little more rare than that. And I always like to tell people it's real. It's just not one of the original 348. And so I got that car, and I'll tell you something about that car. It's just like stupid. I mean, it makes no sense. I mean, it's not comfortable. It's, you sweat in it. You're vulnerable. I mean, it's dangerous as all heck.
It's loud.
Yeah, it's loud. What? I mean, it's really loud, and particularly mine. It's just like ludicrous loud. But it is so fun. Yeah. It's just so cool. So I bought that car and enjoy it and everything. And
it's sitting back here, right?
Yeah, it's behind us back here. And then and it's here at the museum right now, which is kind of interesting because what we actually have a sign on it that talks about Carroll Shelby, because Carroll Shelby was a World War II flight instructor.
Right.
And he flew B-25s and all this stuff. So he's got an interesting story. He has two passions in life: flying and cars. And it's really interesting that there's that crossover. A lot of people don't know that. So kind of use the Shelby Cobra as a way to tell that story of another greatest generation guy.
I think Carroll Shelby's chicken farming overshadows his aviation career.
Yeah.
More people know about that because that was what made him colorful on the racing circuit.
Yeah, wearing the overalls and yeah, exactly. And so we have that here right now on display. And then you asked about some of the other cars, and I used to call myself a car collector with no car collection, and then I was a car collector with a collection of one, and then then you start having these cars that you like, and you crossing them off the list, and maybe one's too many, maybe one's perfect, I don't know. But I grew up in the 80s, and one of my favorite shows, I think so many of us liked the Magnum PI, right?
Absolutely.
We watch them in the 308, the Ferrari 308, and I always thought that was a cool car, and then I forgot about it. And I was at a Cars and Coffee event a few years back, and I was standing there looking at a guy who I have now since become friends with, and he had a 1983 308 red, and I'm sitting there looking at the car, and I start walking around it, and he's nowhere to be found, and I didn't know who he was at the time. And I'm walking around it, and I'm looking at every angle of this thing, and I'm going, this just makes me feel good looking at it. I just love this thing. And then I started reading about them. I knew they were like go-karts, and they were so fun. And they weren't crazy price. They're a little expensive to maintain, but they're not too bad, and you can work on them.
I was going to say
analog.
They have a reputation for being one of the Ferraris that you can turn a wrench on at home.
Yeah.
You mentioned Magnum PI. It was a good show.
It was a good show.
It's a well-produced show.
Yeah.
Great characters. Tom Selleck. How can you not love Tom Selleck?
Yeah. It was just great. Everything about it. It's funny. He wore. He always had the Detroit Tigers ball cap on, but he also occasionally had. It said Da Nang VMO2.
Right.
And 99% of the people out there don't know what VMO2 is, but VMO2 is VMO. It's V fixed wing. That's the naval aviation term. M Marine and O Observation. And so that was a fixed-wing Marine Observation Squadron number 2. They flew bird dogs, which is like my O1 bird dog, right? So anyway, so that ties all this together. I'm looking at this car. I'm just thinking, this is so cool. One of these days, I'm going to own one of these. I'm just going to buy one. And, like a year later or something, I started, we had a visit here. We always have these car clubs come to Lyon Air Museum. It's a great place to go when they park in the parking lot and then they come and enjoy the museum. And we had a 308 group show up. And so I'm out there walking around looking at all the 308s, and I'm looking in the mileage on them. I'm looking in them, and they're like 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 and something thousand miles. I'm like, these people drive these things. So I start talking to a couple of the guys, what's it like to own one of these things? And the passion, they just had so much passion. Oh, wow, this is really cool. I think I might, have to move this up on my list.
Right.
And so I came across one that was really nice, and it was manufactured. I'm a very sentimental person. It was manufactured the month of my 16th birthday. And I go, well, that's kind of like the perfect car. It was for sale.
Yeah.
And so I bought it. And the funny thing is, I bought it on my 50th birthday. Mm-hmm. I didn't wake up that morning to buy it on my 50th birthday. I had looked at it for a couple of weeks. I knew where it was. I just woke up. I was sitting at my desk, and I thought, you know what? Might as well do something, So I bought the car, and I have not regretted it one bit. That is such a fun car. So it's totally different. I have Ford versus Ferrari now, right? Ford v Ferrari, but the 308 is such a, it's kind of high revving. It's like a sewing machine. Once you get up in a certain, like 4,500, 5,500 RPM, it just gets super smooth. The steering wheel is, kind of like this, like a go-kart, and it feels like a go-kart when you drive it, and it's so light and nimble, and it's just such a fun car, and it doesn't make a lot of noise like the Cobra, so I can actually drive it to Laguna Beach and have lunch or something. So I bought that car. So now my collection doubled in size. And I was like, wow, this is nuts, and way too many. But I still had a few cars that I'd always liked, and I always liked E-type Jags.
Sure.
And I think this Porsche thing didn't help. And then the General Lyon's son Bill races Porsches. That didn't help because I was always going to the races and watching that. So all of a sudden I find myself being like a Porsche guy. I'm trying to learn about Porsches, and I like 356 coupes and 911s that kind of have a little race inspired. I kind of like that kind of look, and with this going on, I started looking for Porsches. But at the same time, I had this desire to. I always liked the '65 and '66 Shelby GT350.
Who doesn't, right?
Yeah, right. And so I was kind of looking around, and just not that long ago, I came across one that kind of fit the bill. I didn't want like the stock perfect pretty one. I wanted more driver quality. I wanted something a little, I always say race inspired, but like with the competition, front bumper on it, roll bar, like that kind of thing, the torque thrust wheels, American racing wheels, that kind of feel. And this car was that car. I came across it and I thought, oh my gosh, okay. And so I ended up buying that car as well. And so that's the latest edition. So I've got those three. That's it for now. But someday the Porsche, I'd probably a 911.
Porsches are super comfortable.
Yeah.
Your GT350, was that kind of a stealth sale? Was it advertised?
Yeah. Interesting that you ask. It was advertised on and off over a period of time. The guy his heart wasn't really into selling it, but the car was advertised with a few key words that sometimes make people shy away. And for example, the numbers matching engine wasn't in the car but came with the car. A lot of people don't want to hassle deal with that.
Right.
I found it actually kind of a good thing.
Yeah.
The engine was running when it came out. He only switched it because he had one ready to go, and he was doing a firewall forward kind of restoration on the car, and he thought, oh, I'll stick this in there. And also in the record, it mentioned something about it being wrecked at one point. Well, people shy away from that. Well, I tracked down and found the guy who knew the guy who wrecked it. Turned out it wasn't a wreck. He was Laurel Canyon in the rain near his house, and he bumped into a wall. and did nothing to the car. I mean, like, you know, like you change one little item and it was no big deal. But it's things like that that make people shy away, right? And I see that on Bring a Trailer all the time, where cars are going up and they're going up, and then you get some comments in there, and the people, oh, well, you got to watch out for this, you got to watch it. And I think some people miss out on good cars because they get spooked. And so, you know, you got to kind of look at that stuff and be willing to risk a little bit. When I went to look at this car, I took a guy who is a GT350 expert with me. And we both drove the car, and he crawled all over it, and I had done my research, and I knew all the history on the car and all that kind of stuff, and so it made sense, and so I was able to pick it up. But, you know, it wasn't one of those high visibility sales. It was kind of a quiet sale.
You know, bidding on Bring a Trailer is really cheap thrills.
Oh,
I love doing it.
Oh, I do it, yeah, and I still bid all the time, where I'll know, you know, like, I'll say, yeah, I'll definitely, I could pay for it up to this point, and I would be totally happy because it's worth way more than that. And so sometimes I'll do it without even a lot of thought, you know, and I do the same thing on eBay, you know, and, you know, especially like certain things I know that have a reserve, you know, like I've seen them advertised elsewhere, and I know about where they're going to be, and I'll run them up to what looks like a pretty big number, and I know it's just not going to happen. But if it does, great, you know, and then, you know, it's fun. It's a thrill of doing that. And
I like that buy it now feature on eBay. I don't mess around anymore with stuff. You know, if I need a part, or some kind of piece of memorabilia, I just do it because.
And I'm kind of new to this whole, you know, the buying cars. I'm not a seller. That's the funny thing is I tend to buy and hold. I'm just not I fall in love with stuff. It becomes family members. I know the story. I research the heck out of the car, and I call the former owners if I can, and I document everything, and so I'm not one to just, you know, next month it's a new flavor and I get rid of the other car. I don't do that kind of stuff. But you know, you talk to a lot of people, and I'm not this really wealthy guy. I'm just your average guy. But what I will say is that I think a lot of people miss out because they're trying to get a deal. And if they would just go up a little more, they get the car that they want. And in a few years from now, they're not going to care if they spend an extra X amount of dollars on it.
It's really true.
Yeah.
You should buy the best car you can afford, because if you try to go the other direction initially, you're just going to pay more on the back end.
Yeah, you pay more on the back end, or you miss out.
Yes.
You know, you just don't get it. And then 2 years later, you're still kind of I wish I had that car. But by then, who cares if you paid an extra X amount of, you know, money for it? So, you know, I don't have any retirement money left, but I have these 3 cars. You know?
Don't worry, you won't lose any on those. And that's a great little stable. I mean, they're all 3. They're just different enough, and just they're all exciting in their own way.
Yeah, and I love every one of them. You know, when I'm driving that car, I go, I think this one's my favorite.
Yeah.
You know, and then I get in the next one, I go, oh, maybe this one's my favorite. I mean, I truly love each of those cars because they each bring something to the table.
Have you done a tour yet with the 308, or is that like a rally type?
No, I haven't.
Event? I think that'd be a perfect car for a rally type event.
It would be, and I've been invited. It is a comfortable car, and I'm tall. I mean, I'm at 6'1". I'm not Tom Selleck 6'4" or whatever he was, but he had the seat rails removed, and they bolted the seat to the floor for him, and his head still stuck. He was really tall torso, but I'm pretty comfortable, and I'm used to being hunkered up in something anyway. I kind of like that feel, so it fits me. So I could go on long cross country in that car and wouldn't think much of it. But I've gotten invited a few times, just haven't taken any yet. Yeah.
It'll happen.
Yeah.
We can't end this without talking about all these incredible Porsches in the building right now. What's the deal?
Yeah, I know. It seems kind of odd because we have all these World War II airplanes and we have Porsches. So, you know, we're car guys. There's such a crossover that we want to get as many people to come and learn about the greatest generation about the airplanes. So we started displaying cars, and it started back right when we opened. And the first one we did is we had 10 Duesenbergs in here. So can you imagine 10 Duesenbergs all in one spot? And they looked so nice among the airplanes. I mean, the photo ops just fantastic. So we thought, wow, that was really neat. So the next year we did Packards. And then, you know, we started doing these things. We did vintage motor racing one year, and last year we did Ferraris. And so this year we thought, well, what's the car culture in Southern California? I mean, Porsche is just iconic. So we decided Porsche made sense. We have a lot of friends like, you know, Jeff Zwart with his 906. We had all these great friends around who were willing to display their cars here. So we picked Porsche as the theme. And what we typically do is is we do July 1st through Labor Day, and we have them on display during that time period. Now with the pandemic, lockdowns and so forth, our schedule's been jumbled. So I will say anybody coming out, they should definitely check ahead to make sure that we are actually open during that time period. But there's probably, maybe I'm biased on the whole thing, but no other place where you get this kind of great backdrop, for Porsches, and then you got this A26 in the background, or the DC-3 or the B-17, B-25 or something. So it's really a great setting for it.
Yeah, and the cars that are in here right now, this is kind of a nicely curated assembly here. There are competition cars. There's a 550, a very special 550.
You got the 550. That 550 was driven by Ken Miles at Riverside International Raceway back in 1956. So it's a pretty special car right there.
Absolutely. Mark, tell everyone how to find the museum, and then if you want to share any Instagram accounts or anything like that.
Okay, so Lyon Air Museum is typically open 7 days a week. We're here on the west side of John Wayne Airport. We're at the airport. Best way to know what's going on here is to follow our social media. Lyon Air Museum, spelled with a Y, Lyon Air Museum. Lyon Air Museum for Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. If you want to follow mine personally, which I have a lot of stuff at Lyon Air Museum, I'm on Instagram, and it's Mark R. Foster, so at Mark R. Foster, Mark with a K. Between those, you'll kind of know what's going on. Car events and airplane events and all sorts of stuff. So definitely follow us and keep an eye and make sure you come and visit.
Mark Foster, thanks for having us today. I learned a lot. I hope you enjoyed it too. And if you have questions, comments, what you like, what you hate, someone you'd like to see me interview on the show, you can email me at horsepowerheritage@gmail.com. Until next time, I'm Maurice Merrick. Thanks for listening.